started then. Got it. Okay, so what we're going to talk today about is climate and diet.
Oh, yeah.
Or actually, we're going to talk a little more broadly than that. We'll talk about the whole environment and diet. And when I was thinking about it, the last class we talked about who grows your food. The time before that, it was systemic racism in the food system, and particularly African Americans and their history in the food system. And and given what we learned there and the fact that our food system doesn't really respect people, it's
Hmm.
not surprising that it doesn't respect the environment either. And really, the whole history of agriculture is a gradual encroachment that has accelerated more and more in recent years um, into the environment. So, what I'm going to do now, I'm going to share my screen so that you can see some information about that. Here it is. Okay. And let me put that here, like that. Okay. Everybody sees this?
Yep.
Good. Okay. So, went to. Okay. So, this is something I just found recently that I think is really interesting. And uh, uh, it comes from FAO data. But anyway, if you look at the whole Earth, most of it's water, most of it's ocean, but 29% of it is land. And so let's just think about that 29% land, of which 71% is habitable, and the rest is either covered by glaciers or is so dry that we can't use it effectively. So we got 71% habitable land. Of that habitable land, we use 50% of it for agriculture. So 37% is left as forest, 11% shrub. We've got urban, we've got some freshwater lakes, but 50% of the habitable land is now devoted to agriculture. So if you go back, I don't know how far you'd have to go back, but this is an enormous change if you think about how much land we have taken over and moved it for this purpose. Okay, so how do we use that land? Well, 77%, more than three quarters of that agricultural land is actually devoted to animal agriculture. Now, that's not, bucolic cows grazing in the field. That's a small part of that. It's primarily arable land where we're growing plants that we don't eat ourselves, but we feed to the animals, and then we end up eating the animals. So 77% animal agriculture, 23% um, uh, just for crops that we're going to eat directly. And then the last two lines here are if you think about the global calorie supply for people, for the people in the world, where does our food come from? Well, of the energy, of the calories that come from it, only 18% comes from those animals that we devote so much land to, and 82% comes directly from plant-based food. So most of our energy input comes from this small piece of land, but we have this big other part of land that is devoted to animals. If you look at it on a protein level, because animal products are so rich in protein, then it doubles up. So more than a third of our protein comes from these animals, but still almost two-thirds comes from plant-based food. So that's one piece, and I'll just show you one more here. So that's what we've done to the land of the world with agriculture. This is what we've done to the sort of animal biomass. So what's shown here for both mammals and birds, if you just think of, if you throw them all together and think of them as being one big heap of living material, then of mammals, humans actually comprise 36% of the world's mammalian biomass. Wild animals are only 4%. It's amazing that the humans are, there are 9 times as much biomass in humans in the world than there are in all wild animals put together. And both of those are dwarfed by the animals that we grow for agriculture. So 60% of the mammalian biomass is agricultural animals. And 57% of the bird biomass is just chickens. It's kind of phenomenal. There's a lot of chickens in the world. 14% turkeys and ducks, 29% all those beautiful wild birds that we like to look at so much. So I hadn't seen those things before, and so they were really interesting to me, and I thought they were a good starting point. Does anybody have any comments or questions about those two graphics?
I was wondering if, like that first one about the, protein sources and things like that. I wonder how much that changed, the difference between like the US versus India.
Oh,
In
enormous,
terms of sources of
enormous
protein.
difference.
Yeah.
Yes. It's very, I mean, I don't know the exact numbers, but I do know that, well, it says on a later slide that people in the United States eat twice as much protein as they need to. And so we essentially, I mean, I don't think there's, well, you can argue whether there's negative health consequences to it, but there aren't great negative health consequences to it. But it is much higher in this country than most other countries in the world. Okay.
Another thing is, I remember when somebody visited me from Bolivia and we drove around Mansfield and the corn was high. And I said, that's the corn for the dairy farm up the road. And she said, you feed corn to your cows?
Yes.
It was an interesting comment because that's not universal either.
Absolutely not. And I sometimes wonder how much the cows like it. But anyway, it's certainly an inefficient process. So that's the agricultural system. This is another interesting graphic that looks at the source of greenhouse gases. So we're aware of global warming. We're aware of the fact that we're putting too much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and the consequences of that. But where are they? What are the sources of them? And so on the left-hand side here, these are the sources of the sectors that produce those greenhouse gases. And here's agriculture. So food, agriculture, and land use is 24% of total greenhouse gases. And so, we worry about airlines and cars and stuff, but transportation is over here 14%. So agriculture, much bigger contributor to total greenhouse gas production than is transportation, and it's similar to what we use to produce electricity. And of course, these are the sources of greenhouse gases. This is what pumps carbon into the atmosphere. These are the carbon sinks, and a lot of it will go into the ocean, and some goes well, a little more goes into land sites, which would include being taken up by crops and by trees and so on and so forth. But these two arms are out of balance, and part of the out of balance is that 50% of habitable land that is now devoted to agriculture, which is not acting as a carbon sink in the same way that an old growth forest will. Okay, so let's look at the US and what does agriculture in the US use? Well, it uses 50% of the land area of the United States. It uses 80% of the fresh water, and it uses 17% of the fossil energy. So it's a big contributor. And this is a nice number, 9 billion livestock. Now, most of those are chickens, but 9 billion is an enormous number. So there's more agricultural animals in the United States than there are people in the world. And they eat 7 times as much grain as do the people of this country. So we really are growing that corn and feeding it to the animals. There's all sorts of inefficiencies in that process, including the fact that it takes 100 times more water to produce a kilogram of animal protein than it does a kilogram of grain protein. And as I said, we eat much more protein than needed, with a good part of that protein coming from animals. So as our system is a very protein-oriented system, and therefore an animal-oriented system, that is very, very resource intensive. This is a little bit old. This is 2003, but the bases of it, I think, are still valid. Here are at different agricultural animals and products coming from those animals, and this is the number of them that there were at that time. It can only have gone up, I think. Here's those chickens. So this is 8,000 million. So this is 8 billion of the 9 billion that we talked about. And so then in the final column, what we have is the ratio of energy input to protein output. So how much energy, how much fossil energy does it take to put into the system to get a unit of protein out? And it's phenomenal. Quite variable. I don't understand. I read the paper to try and understand why lamb is the top of the list. I don't understand that, and they didn't explain it.
Lamb is it just because it's lamb and not sheep? I mean, if they're so young, is there some disproportionate amount that goes into them?
So we eat lambs, little lambs. We don't let them go into mutton. I don't know. Maybe it's an idea.
Although you think that energy input would be greater if they're older. So I don't know. It's
yeah. Just in comparison, if we were to use corn as our protein source, it would take 2.2 kilocalories of fossil energy to produce each kilocalorie of protein. So plants are much more efficient. Although chickens are not bad.
You know, that's where the eggs doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, the eggs doesn't make sense to me either. And so there's something there. You know, there's all sorts of calculations that lie behind these numbers that are not transparent. And so the eggs don't make. I don't understand why this is so high, and the broilers that the broilers aren't the same animals that are producing the eggs. So maybe it's something to do with the animal husbandry, but you wouldn't expect it to have a tenfold difference. Anyway, so it's when I was teaching at UConn, I would show people. I had to explain the food pyramid to them, because now we don't use the food pyramid. The USDA teaching tool is a plate, and with the different portions of ingredients on it. But you're probably familiar with a food pyramid because it was used before the plate. This isn't the one that the USDA uses. This is actually a Mediterranean food pyramid, but the principle is the same, i.e., from a dietary perspective, from a nutrition and health perspective, we should concentrate on the base of the pyramid and base our diet around these foods, with less and less of foods as we go to the top of the pyramid. So this is a Mediterranean diet pyramid, and they're suggesting to us that we don't have too many desserts and very little red meat and so on and so forth. So what's interesting about it is that this organization produced in parallel an environmental pyramid. And the environmental pyramid is from low to high is looking at the environmental impact of producing those foods. And so foods with a low environmental impact are here at the bottom. Foods with high environmental impact are here at the top. And what's interesting is that, with some exceptions, there's pretty good agreement between what is being recommended for health from a dietary perspective and what is being recommended for health of the planet from an environmental perspective.
What I don't understand is the legumes.
The legumes.
They're third, fourth category up in
Here they are
environmental
here.
impact.
So why are they?
Yeah, why
Yes.
are they so high? That doesn't make sense. They have nitrogen in them. They may take a little more to grow, but they're plants.
They're
It's-
plants. We have, I mean, maybe, I don't know.
Along with
This
the
is-
eggs, it's kind of strange.
Yep. This
Maybe
is
the
their
processing.
definition of environmental impact.
I wonder if it's soy with the legumes, because we produce so much soy. I don't know.
But in terms of what it takes to grow it,
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, if
This is
if
their
it is soy,
definition that underlies it. The amount of
It's-
soil and water necessary to regenerate the resources used throughout the life cycle of a product, from the field to the waste pile. So if we go, so that's what this axis is. And so, you know, there are some peculiarities here, things we understand, things we don't understand. But I think the basic principle is clear. And so this is something that we can come back to in the future.
So the Headley, let's see if I get this right.
Yep.
The pyramid on the right, the environmental pyramid, is that the fruits, the fruit potatoes on the bottom use low energy or low. Is that what that is? The low energy?
Yeah. Yes. So it takes fewer resources to produce them. So, but both in terms of energy input, in terms of water needed, in terms of land use, et cetera, et cetera. So
Now,
the impact on the planet, on the environment, is relatively low per
No.
unit of food produced.
Now on the food pyramid,
Yes.
see if I get this right because it's very confusing.
Yeah. Keep asking.
The ones that say high, the food pyramid, is that amount of soil they need in order to be produced?
No.
What is that?
That's high in your diet.
Should be
it
high
is-
in our diet.
Yes, it is
Okay.
recommended. So this axis on the left here is recommending the amount that we
Amount
should
of fruit,
eat.
right?
So these are things that we should base our diet upon. Large amounts of these things, smaller amounts as you go up the
Up,
pyramid. So
okay.
least amounts of these.
Right, which makes sense. This is what we think. Oh, 3 to 5 helpings of fruit and vegetables a day.
Yes.
Lean meats, whole grains. At least that's what I was taught.
Sounds good to me.
Sounds good, and I try to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And so the question that someone asked about where the legumes were, as far as their stress on the environment
Mhm.
Yes.
seems
So that-
high,
right.
and yet these are foods that it's listed. If you look on the food pyramid, they're there.
Right.
that we should be eating those.
Right. So understand that these pyramids are produced independently.
Yeah.
So this is a bunch of nutritionists getting together saying this is a good diet to recommend to people.
Mhm.
This is a bunch of environmental analysts getting together saying, trying to figure out what the impact of growing these things is on the planet. So they're determined quite separately,
Mhm.
and then just put together for comparison.
Okay.
And so it doesn't mean that we should eat like this necessarily, but we should take this into account. For
Right.
example, here's our slice of pie down here, or cake, or whatever it is. It doesn't take too much resource to produce these desserts, but we don't really want to base our diet on them.
No, we don't. It has its effects. It has negative impact on one's system.
On the human body.
There's an environmental impact when the healthcare system has to treat sick people.
Exactly. And with that, I had a bunch of cookies today because I haven't had them in a long time.
Once in a while is just fine.
Yes.
Okay, so there are all sorts of, in the same source of data gives all sorts of other things. So this is here what they're portraying is the, I can't read, is the ecological footprint of different foods. So you can look at these foods, and essentially these ones at the top are ones with a large ecological footprint. A lot of resource goes into producing them, and you can just look at this and compare. I didn't mean to go quite that fast.
Yeah.
Here, the ecological footprint is divided into the dark green, which is what it takes to cook them,
Mhm.
and then that's part of the whole total. So there's different. The ecological footprint can come from different places. So
So
maybe a part of the legume
Yeah.
question is
Yeah.
the fact you have to cook them for so long.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But I don't know how much of it is that. But that will be part of it. If
Yeah.
if you eat a salad, then you don't no cooking energy needed. If you cook your soybeans for 3 hours, then that
Mhm.
takes energy to do that.
One
So
thing,
that's the ecological footprint. This is the carbon footprint. I mean, we don't have to go through all the details of this, but it's the same thing comes through in each case.
Yeah.
It's these animal products that are at the top. Fruit is right down here. Fruit and vegetables, low down.
Mhm.
So we have carbon footprint, and then we have water footprint.
Okay.
And one could say that legumes are still way down compared to something like beef,
Yes.
right?
Yes. And so if you're concerned about getting enough protein in your diet, then legumes are going to be a better choice than from this perspective.
Mhm.
Could you go back to the previous slide for a sec? Where's dairy? Dairy is way low. Very interesting.
It is interesting.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Because it's a cow just the same putting out methane.
Yeah.
yeah.
Right?
Well,
You
yeah.
have that same cow for years where the meat, you're growing the cow to butcher it.
Yeah.
But I don't know, it's interesting.
It is interesting, and the husbandry of that cow is probably quite different from
Yeah.
the ones that go to the concentrated feeding lots and stuff.
You're probably getting a lot more milk protein and milk quantity out of a cow
Yes.
when it's used for that purpose
Yes.
than a cow that you get just the beef that's in its body
Right.
for sale.
Yeah. What about, does goat's milk and that kind of thing in here, and
I
Chevrolet
don't
cheese?
think it's in there. I don't know if it's different or not.
Mhm.
Let me show you one more. So that was the water. There's this other interesting paper that I found that comes from the United Kingdom, where they try to look at it globally. So in the United Kingdom, food comprises 27% of the direct greenhouse gas emissions.
Oh,
So growing that food, providing that food. it provides 19% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. The difference between direct and total is that if you live in England, you're probably importing all sorts of stuff from China and other parts of the world, and so if you're consuming it, then the greenhouse gases used to produce that item really should be on your budget rather than the Chinese budget. And so that's why that's what it means by total. And so this percentage is a smaller amount. But anyway, what the people in this study did was they took all food sold in UK grocery stores, in a UK supermarket, and they divided them up into different categories. And it doesn't seem to me that everything quite is here, but there's an awful lot here. And what they did is calculate the carbon footprint of those food items from farm to waste pile, essentially. So, well, no, it's not farm to waste pile, it's farm to supermarket checkout. And so there's the source, there's the food, there's processing of the food, there's packaging, there's transit, there's second transport to the distribution center, et cetera, there's refrigeration. And so for all these different categories of foods, this is that they figured out this was the carbon footprint. And
Really, could you translate what cabinet means in this?
no, actually, I can guess, but I came across this paper 5 years ago, and I've never. It doesn't define it well in the paper, but what there is cabinet and counter.
Yeah.
And so what I assume is that cabinets are something that you self-serve from, and counter is something where, like a deli counter where or a meat counter where you get it from a person. I don't know why they would make that distinction. And if you look at,
Or one of them's pre-prepared and one of them you buy raw to cook at home.
I don't think
could be.
all of the counter are going to be, because there are different things. I mean, that would be included, but I don't think that's all of it. So you've got counter fresh meats, for example.
Yeah.
So that's not prepared.
Yeah.
But I don't think it matters. So the reason why I haven't really dug into it to find out, because it doesn't seem to make a big difference. And so
Yeah, I was just curious.
yeah, it is curious. And so that's one thing. So trying to understand it. But what else do you see? So what do you see when you look at this array of foods? Any trends? Anything that looks interesting? Anything that stands out?
Well, the counter fresh meats really
It's the winner.
seems to be the one that's is way out ahead.
Yeah.
What's interesting that cheese is so high and milk is low.
Yes.
Okay, I'm looking at that. Where is that? Okay,
Toward the bottom,
towards the bottom.
cheese is like the sixth one up or something, and it goes way out.
Oh,
and
yeah,
milk is
counter
way
cheese.
lower.
Yeah, that's a lot. Yeah, and
Go down a few to whatever long life milk means.
yeah,
Long
long
life
life
is ultra high temperature
But
treatment.
cabinet milk is similar.
Yes.
cabinet.
It's up toward the top, but or top middle.
Yeah,
There's milk.
yeah.
So it
It's similar.
doesn't make
Yeah.
much difference there.
Maybe a lot of people don't drink milk,
Well,
whereas they'll eat more cheese
this is per unit food.
per
So
unit
this
food.
isn't what people are eating. This is, if you did eat this is the greenhouse gases that would have been associated with it.
Interesting.
So it's per unit of food, not how much gets eaten.
Per unit of food.
So no more tomatoes.
That's the amount of water, right?
Yeah, there's tomatoes. So
Oh yeah, look at the tomatoes.
it depends.
Oh,
Well, so compare tomatoes and potatoes.
oh yeah.
Compare them to other root vegetables.
And nuts are relatively low, and yet I've read some things, And actually, it's been interesting. I've read almonds are very high water content.
right?
And yet I've also heard that the dairy industry wants people to think that because they're drinking almond milk and it's a competitor. So who knows? Because
Yes.
it's very low here, nuts in
Yeah,
general.
but this isn't looking at water. This is greenhouse gases.
Okay, so it's
Just-
not the overall
it's
impact.
just
That's right.
related to.
Just greenhouse.
It hasn't
Yep.
looked at how much water has been required to
Yeah,
produce
yeah.
these things.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
One of the ones that always interests me here is this exotic veg and mushrooms.
Yeah.
Transport.
And because you can look at this is one of the things we can see. So this is this sort of aqua kind of color here is large for this, and that relates to transport emissions.
Mhm.
So if you buy your exotic veg and it's flown here from wherever, then that's a big carbon cost to that.
Oh,
A la the mangoes I love to eat.
Exactly, we love them.
Yeah.
And it fascinates me that bananas are so low, and the explanation that I'm given for that is they all come by ship.
Ah.
You
Oh.
don't need to fly them.
Because they ripen slowly.
They ripen slowly. You have them in a controlled atmosphere.
Mhm.
They've figured it out.
Yeah.
Sort of.
Wow.
yeah.
Interesting.
But anyway, so we look at all that, and so this is what they did with it. So this is what I told you already. They looked at what people are eating currently in the United Kingdom and calculated based on all those that data that was in the previous graph that I showed you, how much carbon dioxide per person per day was required to produce that food on the current diet. And then they did a different calculation. This is what people are eating now, current diet. They calculated, well, supposing they became what they term a thoughtful vegetarian or a thoughtful vegan.
Compared to one who isn't thoughtful?
Well, there are many unthoughtful vegetarians and many unthoughtful vegans, but I'm assuming from their perspective, a thoughtful diet is one that meets nutritional needs and is not too is one that would be recommended by a dietitian. Let's put it that way. And so, if you look at how much greenhouse gases would be required to produce this diet or this diet, interestingly, they're essentially identical, which also I don't understand. I would have thought that a thoughtful vegetarian diet might include some cheese, and we just noted in the previous slide that cheese has a lot of gases associated with it. So I don't understand. Maybe this vegan is a little less thoughtful than the
vegans eat a lot of tomatoes and mushrooms.
Maybe, but the vegetarian could eat, the same things. But anyway,
yeah,
we won't worry about that. The important point is that doing this would reduce emissions by 25%. So if everybody in England was to become a vegetarian overnight and eat accordingly, they would reduce 25% of their food associated carbon emissions. It's also actually cheaper, which is another interesting thing. And that's equivalent to taking half the cars off the road of the United Kingdom.
Oh,
So taking meat out of your diet has an enormous effect in terms of different things that might be done to reduce carbon emissions.
and if they isolated beef rather than other meat, fish products,
Yes.
it might be not that different what we're looking at here, because beef is such a huge factor.
Yeah.
Yes. So if we I mean, I don't think the life of a broiler chicken is anything to, to aspire to or to favor. But if we ate chickens rather than beef, it would be better from this perspective.
Well, I just contributed tonight to this greenhouse thing. I had a very nice, very well cooked, properly cooked beef burger.
Yes, delicious.
It was awesome.
Yes,
Haven't had one in a while.
right. And that's the issue, isn't it?
Yeah,
So the world is not going to come to an end if you have a beef burger once in a while.
right.
Um, I thought that this the next two slides are summaries, a summary of the report from which those first data about agriculture use were taken. Their focus is not so much on climate change; it's more on biodiversity loss. But I thought it was very well expressed, what they had, the way they put it in their summary. And so I thought I would just share this with you. And
Yeah.
I won't read it. I'll just leave you to read this now. The first point is things are happening at such a rate now that, no historical comparisons. And agriculture is the important issue, the food system. This is interesting. This is something that Michael Pollan talks about, our need to have cheap food. That's the important thing. Food is like widgets. Food is a commodity. Food is something to be profit from, and so we need to produce this item as cheaply as possible. The more cheaply we can produce it, the more space there is to make a profit from selling it.
But the implication of that third bullet seems to be also that cheap food doesn't really pay the full price.
That's
because
right.
The
That's
rest
right.
of what we see there's a big price for the destruction that's involved.
Yes, you come in, you open it, you start a big industrial farm somewhere, you destroy the soil, you pollute the waterways surrounding that farm. You have to pay for none of that. The only economic consequence to destroying the soil is it becomes less productive, so you just have to put more fertilizer in it to try and get your yields, to maintain your yields, and so then the surrounding environment gets even more polluted. But so it's essentially the capitalist system taken applied to the food system with all sorts of negative consequences. So then there's two more points that they have, and essentially it's the way that we've chosen to run agriculture in this country is not sustainable for the reasons we just stated. Um, for all of the inputs and the damage that it causes. And this, from a biodiversity perspective, has many negative consequences on the rest of the fauna and flora surrounding it.
Where can we get these two last, the previous page and this one? How can we get copies of this?
I'll put a link. I'll
Okay.
send you it. This is the link down here at the bottom. I
Okay.
don't expect you to write that down, but we'll Chelsea and I will make sure that you get access to it. I think it's a really good report.
I think so too. This is something that we can discuss in one of the groups that I'm with, and to share this so that we can talk about this.
Right.
And, so it would be, this is very helpful. Thank you.
So I'm not sure. So we're still the same people here. So I don't know that we need to go into breakout rooms because there would be not many people in the room. And we seem to be getting the discussion going already. So let me take off this share and give you a chance to talk about what you have just seen, what you have just learned. Is it new information to you? Is it familiar? What do you think about it? And then what do we think about the role of meat in our diet?
Yeah. Um,
So Robin, let's
protein, I think.
maybe Robin can maybe let's give Robin a chance, who's I think listening. Um, but is there anything that you want to say, Robin, if you can hear us now, or if you can talk?
Mm,
Okay,
not available.
let's hear from others then.
Well, balance is always important in anything, and certainly in what one eats is important. I remember growing up in the town that I was in, there were several farms in the area, and we tried to get our products from the farms when we could. It was just better. That doesn't exist today. They're gone. So at least in this New England region, of course, I know traveled out west across country, we saw enormous farms. We saw enormous farms, in particular of the soy, with corn, enormous farms with wind energy, and some cattle. Not as much as I thought I would see, but some cattle. We can't get away from it, but as you've mentioned, it has to be managed better. We're a people, I think, that feel that our protein must come from some sort of meat.
That's-
Psychological thing. Psychological, the meat. We have to have that meat so we can have that protein.
Well, does everybody here think they need to have the meat?
No, I think that's a lot of people think that way.
Right. But that's why I'm asking other people to now, you know, what do other people think here?
Well, I think it's great that the foods that are the most nutritious to eat are also the ones that cause the least harm to the environment.
Right.
And that's wonderful. That's a great confluence of two positives. And I found myself wondering, because I think vegetarianism and veganism is becoming a little bit more popular, I found myself wondering what nutritionally and in terms of greenhouse gases, what is the effect of like the Impossible burgers and those kinds of meat substitutes that are becoming more popular? I wonder if anybody knew anything about that.
That's a good question. Does anybody know anything about that? I mean, so people love their meat, and we can either make something that approximates meat from plants, or even, you know, to take it further, you can make meat in a laboratory. You can grow it in a laboratory rather than in a cow, and produce something that you know, tastes like meat. But I don't know what I'm sure for laboratory meat, the resource utilization is ridiculous. But does anybody know for Impossible Burgers what are they what their carbon footprint is?
When you refer to Impossible burgers, what do you refer? I don't know the word. What are you using in reference to?
You want to talk about it? Tell us a bit.
It's a non-meat substitute for beef for hamburgers. And like if you go to some of the big chains that specialize in burgers, they now will give you a choice of having what's called an impossible burger, which is basically something that's made to taste like a hamburger, but doesn't have any actual meat in it.
Yeah, veggie burgers.
It's a sophisticated veggie burger, is
Yeah.
what it is.
Yeah.
A
But
veggie burger
it's supposed to look and taste exactly, as close to meat as you can. It when you cut into it, if it's rare, it looks like it has blood in it. It's very close to what real beef is supposed to look like. So I myself prefer, like, if I'm gonna have, if I want to eliminate the meat, I would just as soon have a plant-based dish.
Mhm.
But that's just my preference. I also find myself wondering the same question about, non-dairy cheeses and other products that are supposed to taste like meat or dairy and yet are not. I just don't know if they're any healthier for you than if you just ate the dairy.
Yeah. Yeah. I hear you.
Anybody else wanna?
Huh.
I mean, I think the overall question about whether or not we need meat to be healthy is no. Overall, if vegetarians are eating in a way that's thoughtful, they generally, we find they're healthier because there's less saturated fat that they're eating, et cetera, things that, are bad for the heart. So generally, we don't need to eat meat to be healthy. So that's one, I think we just know that there's good substitutes for both protein and the other nutrients that come in meat. But the one thing that came up that made me think is not just the highly processed meat substitutes, but the big factory farms that are out there now, rather than a lot of small local farms. But there's an emerging movement over the past decades to support local farms. And there's an emergence of maybe more of them locally. And so the question of carbon footprint of a small farm that grows cows compared to a factory farm that grows cows. And even though overall beef is not the best thing, is there some difference there? I mean, I have no interest in eating beef, but I think it's a useful question.
I think it's a great question because I like beef, and
Me
so I
too.
don't eat it very often, but I do like the taste of it. And so if I go to my local farmer's market and I buy Kindred Crossings beef that has been grown in Connecticut and raised on a pasture, I think, is that different from a beef that I might buy at Stop and Shop that has resulted from a concentrated feeding operation somewhere out, who knows where? And is that a rational part of a diet? So is it more important where I get my meat from rather than eliminating it entirely?
I mean, you wouldn't have the transport, you wouldn't have the corn going into it, but you would have the methane coming out of the cow.
Yes.
So some of the factors would be similar, but maybe it would be somewhat less because of the others.
And if the cow is eating grass
Mhm.
rather than food that is, and being consuming that grass in particular in an area that isn't really conducive to growing something else. I think of sort of the Welsh hillsides and stuff like that. So difficult to farm grain on if the animal is feeding in from that source, which isn't a human source. That maybe makes a difference too.
That's
There
an
are also ecosystems which evolved in coordination with grazing ruminants, many of which have since had their populations really sort of decimated. I'm thinking of like the American bison. And there is some evidence that you can graze animals in a way that builds up topsoil. If you like don't overgraze, if you're rotating, if you let the land be fallow for a while, and then topsoil, if continually built up, can actually be a carbon sink. So it definitely, one cow is not necessarily equivalent to another cow, depending on what the cow is doing.
Right.
And I would think there'd be a difference too in if you're gonna go to the time when indigenous people lived with their bison,
Mhm.
they probably, one, ate the entire animal, two, didn't eat as much of it per person.
Yeah.
You know, the balance of what they ate might have been different. There's so many other factors about how that whole context was different from what we're used to now.
Absolutely. I also did some quick Googling about the Impossible Burger. And I mean, it seems that they have had some external studies which suggest that it's less of a carbon footprint and less of a water footprint. But there are also critics suggesting that because the supply chain is not very transparent, because it's all quite new and there are so many ingredients in it, it's too hard to say whether or not those analyses are actually including the whole supply chain.
Right.
Thank you.
Where if you made a lentil burger at home, it would certainly be different.
And what about pigs? So, pigs have got a lot going for them, I think. It's interesting that pigs are, I mean, if you're Muslim, if you're Jew, then pigs are forbidden. But, they occupy a very different ecological niche. I can remember in the good old days when I worked in restaurants in England, the pig man would come to the restaurant to take the scraps, to take the waste. And pigs will eat our scraps.
Mhm.
And so living somewhere and having a pig in your backyard, there might be some rationality to that.
They used to do that in one of the towns that I grew up in, and you could leave. They would come pick it up, and it was food scraps for the pigs, and that it happened regularly, and they would do that, and it was great because then we didn't have to put that in the regular trash and have that smell, and and then that all stopped. And my mother goes, "What? Now we have to just find a place to put this food stuff that's it's going to smell the whole place." So it's too bad because they really did feed the pigs with those food scraps.
Well, I mean, again, it's the concentrated feeding operation. So it has been, they've figured out cheaper ways and quicker ways of growing pigs very fast in concentrated operations. And so that, they've decided more money is to be made than doing it
Yeah.
that way than feeding them our scraps.
So for what it's worth, because it's not very specific in terms of data, but this is, I mentioned this to you heavily, it's the Nutrition Action on Climate. And the basic idea is if we're going to feed 10 billion people in 2050, how are we going to do it well? And what, the recommendation from Willett is red meat, beef, pork, and lamb would be quite low at no more than 1 serving a week. Seafood, eggs, and poultry could each go to 2 servings a week. Other protein would come from plants like beans, soy foods, and nuts. So pork is put into the same lumped category as beef in this. It's from Harvard, and
Can you hold that up so I can get the title?
Yeah, and I can make the.
We'll also give you that. You can read this online. I looked it up after Grace told me about it, and so we'll give you the citation for that as well.
They've just put their publication online. You and I talked about that, and they're an announcement in either this or the next month's one, saying their whole archive is now online for the first time. So
this one you can read online.
Yeah.
So it's available. So that's good.
Thank you.
Okay.
I had someone write in the chat. I think Robin responded, "It has me thinking about culture and how personal food is. Changing to a more sustainable diet, changing habits requires these kinds of educations in school systems and other ways of shifting the conundrum and challenges to make a difference with climate change."
Yep. Absolutely right.
Yeah.
We're very attached to the way that we eat.
Yes. It's hard to change it. It's hard to change one's ways.
So I want to move on because there's one more topic that I want to cover here and give you the chance to think about. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's come back to this. Here we go. So let's move on one. I thought there was this. I moved on to. Just to finish this piece off.
Yeah.
That same Chatham House report had 3 recommendations to preserve biodiversity. One is we should change our diets. You know, much as Walter Willett was saying and Grace was talking about just now, a much greater emphasis on plants, and there'd be all sorts of benefits to that. Second, we need to preserve land in its natural state in order to preserve biodiversity, increase biodiversity. And then thirdly, we need to farm in a more rational way rather than a for-profit way. That moving away from monoculture and high input kinds of things to polyculture farming practices that maybe will have a place for cows in them. But that's you can we'll make sure you get the reference in so you can read the whole report. But here's another way to look at things here. So the average human, the average adult human needs to eat about 2,000 kilocalories. Men a little more, women a little less, just depends on your body size. But anyway, you need, that's what you need to consume to maintain your energy. What this graphic shows is that in order for you to end up with 2,000 calories on your plate, we actually have to grow 2.3 times as much food. So there are 2 major reasons for that. One is food loss and food waste, and the second is the inefficiency of animal to plant conversion. So if you start at harvest, what do we get? So of this 4,600 calories that were harvested, then during that process of before it leaves the farm essentially, and in the early transportation phases, about 600 calories are lost. And then when we take a lot of that food and feed it to animals rather than eat it directly ourselves, then if the animals are eating it, we are not. And so that's 1,700 kilocalories lost. But then we do eat the animals, and so we get some of it back. I'm surprised it's quite this much, but let's just take their word for it. But so we get some back. But anyway, we've lost a large part. And then in the latter phases, in the expired foods, waste in restaurants, things lost in the back of your refrigerator, 800 calories are also lost. So if you sum up all these losses, you find you need to grow this amount in order to consume this amount.
Wow. Wow.
And so we just, spent the previous hour talking about the ecological costs of producing the food. And what we now learn is that, a lot of it is going to waste. So remember, there's the waste part and there's the animal part. So we already talked about the animal part. So let's talk about the waste part a little bit. Here we go. I love this graphic. So this is the calculation that has been done. If you were to look at the greenhouse gases associated with all the food that is grown and then thrown away, not eaten, then those greenhouse gases would make waste food the 3rd largest contributor of all the countries in the world. So only China and the United States, their total greenhouse gas footprint is greater than that associated with food wastage.
Wow. Hmm.
And so if we're interested in reducing greenhouse gases, uh, in reducing the climate change, then then eliminating food waste. I mean, you can still eat beef and eliminate food waste. Eliminate, reduce beef and eliminate food waste, and now you're really cooking. And these brown boxes are worth reading as well, actually. So this is how much is 8% of total anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions are from wasted food. And so the wasted food, the emissions for wasted food is 87% of global road transport emissions.
Oy vey.
Gee.
Do you have available, are you coming to a slide, or do you know how the amount of waste compares across countries?
Yes. This is how it compares across foods. So this is the contribution. So if the carbon footprint associated or food waste is total 100%, all the food waste, these are the different categories of foods that contribute to that. And of course, something like fruits are a large. The orange is food waste. The blue is carbon footprint associated with that food waste. So we end up, letting fruit rot. So it's a large contributor to food waste. But it doesn't take as much, it's not associated with that much greenhouse gas emissions. So the carbon footprint associated with that food loss is not such a big contributor. Whereas we don't throw away that much meat. I guess it's expensive and people preserve it more, conserve it more. But because it's got such a large carbon footprint, it's a major contributor to the greenhouse gases associated with that.
Hmm.
So these are the different contributors. These are the different stages at which food waste or food loss can occur, right from stuff that never gets picked in the field. Maybe it's mechanized, maybe so it's not totally efficient. Different processing and transport phases, lost in storage, and then so this is the producer end of things, and this is the consumer end of things. Um, and what they say here, I actually disagree with. Um, and I'll show you why in the next slide, which is the slide Grace was asking for. What they suggest is that rich countries are pretty good. They have an efficient agricultural system, so they don't waste much at the beginning, whereas so-called developing countries do waste more at the beginning because their infrastructure is not as well developed. Whereas at these later stages, rich countries throw away food with gay abandon because they can afford to, or some people in those countries can afford to. Whereas when there's less resource, then food gets conserved. Once you have it, you're going to use it and make sure it gets used. And that sort of makes sense, except it doesn't seem to be what happens, because this doesn't look at by country, but it looks at food waste by continent, or more or less, sort of by continent, I guess. Um, and so the dark green are the early phases from the farm to retailing, it says here, and then the light green is consumer associated losses. And if you look at the dark green, it doesn't actually change that much between different countries, different areas of the world. The only exception is in South and Southeast Asia. They seem to have a more efficient production system because there's less wastage there. But North America wastes more food, or a greater percentage of food in those early phases than does sub-Saharan Africa. So that previous slide doesn't quite make sense to me. I think that in general, rich countries waste more food than does the global South. So losses in say sub-Saharan Africa, maybe the infrastructure isn't there to get the food transported well to markets. Here, I think that mechanization maybe has losses associated with it. It's cheaper to do it that way, and we throw food out because it's cheaper to do that than to have a more expensive way of picking that food. And also because we we don't like ugly food. So if the food doesn't look right, it's hard to sell. And so that's another reason why losses might be higher in the wealthy countries. But the big difference is between the consumer end of things.
Yeah, I think it maybe just said the same thing, but we can afford to waste it at the consumer end. So proportionally, it looks like we're doing better at the production end, but it's really not. It's kind of a.
It's really not. Yes,
It's not, really not.
We're bad on both ends.
Headley, can you go back 2 slides to the one that has the mark? So if you look at the consumer end, processing, packaging, and marketing are before the consumer actually gets the food. So we may waste food at the table, but it seems to be overall, it's one small factor, even on the consumer end, because processing, packaging, and marketing are part of that whole package.
Yes, so it's they're I'm not sure exactly in this slide. Sorry, in this going backwards in this slide whether this says production to retailing. So I think the division here may be a little different than the division here. So it may come down to here, and then they're looking just at wastage by consumer in that next slide.
Right.
Yeah, but it's interesting in this one because it's not giving us numbers, but
right. It's
just interesting to know how much the processing and packaging, for example,
right,
involves loss or waste.
yes.
And then the marketing, it'd be interesting to know what that actually means.
I'm also thinking that,
marketing, I think, is in the supermarket or in the restaurant.
I see. Okay, in the point of sales,
Right.
or the point of
I would guess that's what it means.
yeah, that makes sense.
So these are processing and packaging is in a factory of some kind,
Yeah,
producing some food, and then this is selling it. And
yeah.
This is once we got our hands on it.
I'm also thinking that some of the production losses in other countries like Latin America may actually be lost not because of their practices, but because because so much food is exported to the United States and it gets rejected right at the field. Like my daughter was traveling in Latin America and finding people who were growing fruit, let's say for dole, where if some of the crop didn't look perfect, rather than trying to sort out which pieces of fruit they wanted or didn't want, they just rejected the whole crop.
Oh my God.
And wouldn't buy it.
Yeah.
Oh.
It's terrible.
Yeah.
Oh,
At these later ends, so here's a truck delivering it either to a restaurant or to your house. I guess there's a supermarket or a grocery store or something in between there. But of this these latter parts of the chain, this is the way of 100% of the food waste. This is the different kinds of foods that contribute to it. And mostly it's perishable food, so we don't waste that much meat again because we it's expensive when we hold on to it. Um, Lots of fruits and vegetables, lots of dairy, because those things go off. Um, and this is sort of interesting because what this is telling us, assuming we believe the elaboration of USDA data, is that 60% of the waste is actually in our homes, of the waste in these final stages. So some is distribution, some is at the retail end, but we go and we buy a lot of food and we don't eat a good part of that food.
I wonder if much has changed in the past 30 years,
Yeah.
because that is 1995.
Well, there's certainly a greater consciousness about this as an issue now, but I'm not sure it's translated through to that much change behavior. We'll see. So of different categories of food, this is the percentage of that food that is wasted in these latter stages again. Oops, I'm having a hard time with my screen at the moment. Let's go back. This is what we're looking at. Consumer, consumer, retail, and distribution. So again, vegetables, a lot gets wasted, 35%. Overall, about a third gets wasted in this country. And this is the greenhouse gas emissions associated with that waste. So that the previous slide was what food gets wasted, but this is, if we're thinking about climate change, this is the cost of it in terms of contributing to greenhouse gases. So we don't waste that much beef, but of the beef that is wasted is a large contributor compared to other foods to the climate equation.
And this one does delineate pork as separate and much less than beef in its impact.
Yes.
And eggs as really low, which was different from some of the slides we saw very early on.
Right. So this
And-
is greenhouse gases from waste. So it could be either because we don't waste as many eggs, and eggs do have a nice long shelf life. So
Right. True.
so it's a composite between how much we waste of that particular food and how much greenhouse gases are associated with producing that food. And so if you look at these different areas of the world, this is per capita food wastage footprint. And
Per
so,
year, per,
800 kilograms of CO2. It's a global average. I think it must be per year. I don't really know the units, but
North American Oceania, industrial Asia.
so North America is compared to sub-Saharan Africa about fourfold, which is what you would think.
yeah.
So we might all become vegetarians, or we might all waste less food,
Or both.
or both. This is another pyramid that shows potential ways of reducing food waste or dealing with food waste. And in this pyramid, then in this case the bottom, but the small end, the sharp end, is the least desirable. So this is the best. This is the worst. And one thing to realize about putting food waste into landfills is that then they degrade in such a way that they produce greenhouse gases
Hmm,
and therefore contribute to environmental harm that way.
yeah.
Um, and so so this is an inverse pyramid. Um,
It's interesting about feeding animals is that like pigs and chickens, would those be the animals that you would feed like scraps and things?
I don't know what's happened to my screen. I don't know what you can see. Let me stop the share because something funny happened. Let me see. Say again, Chelsea.
So when it says feeding animals, you can't feed food waste to like cows and things. So that would be chickens and pigs. Would that be what would be under feeding animals?
Right. So it's what we were talking about before. That Alma remembers and I remember of the pig man comes, and they have a small operation and a few pigs, and they get food for their pigs from restaurants or from houses.
Yeah.
Or there are parts of the world, China for example, where every house has a pig.
Oh, that's right.
And there's certainly plenty of houses that have chickens.
Right. It's interesting.
An interesting one was that composting was the second or third from the bottom. And probably two different things. One is you peel your carrot and that scrap gets composted as compared to put in landfill and
Yes.
becomes soil, and that's a good thing. But if you're wasting the whole carrot and then it gets composted, I guess it's just more waste. It's more, I mean, probably better that than a landfill, but it's interesting that it had, I'm surprised that it's so low, meaning second source of the problem.
Well, essentially, if we're composting it, we're returning it to soil,
Mhm,
which is useful because we can use that compost to grow new food.
mhm,
But there's a lot. There's if you think about all the effort that's gone into making that food,
mhm.
turning it into fertilizer is better than burying it, but it's not as good as
Choosing it.
actually
Yeah.
adjusting your food system so that food that's surplus at some earlier stage gets to people that could eat it directly.
Mhm, mhm.
So the top of the pyramid. Let me see if I can get back to it without losing it. Um, Here it is. So these things. So maybe we can figure out our system so that we don't waste as much food. Maybe
Right.
we can pick it better on the farms. Maybe we can store it better so that it doesn't get so it never becomes waste at all. But if we have food that is going to become waste and we don't know what to do with it and it's lost its commercial value, that's the key thing, I guess. It still has value in that people would happily eat it as long as it's still in good shape. And then there's a one after that where the pig doesn't care if it's in good shape or not.
Mhm.
And so these are ways in which we're using more of the resource that's gone into growing that food rather than sort of accepting that it's going to degrade back into nutrients that feed the soil.
And then we also feed less animals, like the production. Oh, I guess that wouldn't play into food waste.
What happens with things like, well, that's where my question is about the beef, things that are wasted, parts of the beef you don't eat and that sort of stuff. And you can't compost those. It's not like vegetables and fruits that you can compost.
Well, you actually can if you do it in an industrial level.
Oh, how?
If you have high temperature, there are commercial composting systems that can deal with animal products. So I don't put meat in my compost pile. but I think that there are composters that can deal with that.
Oh, but does that, if they're composting it, does that then mean they're putting out a lot of greenhouse gases?
I don't, I don't know how much greenhouse gases come off my compost pile.
I'm
That's a
talking
good
about
question.
the stuff, the beef stuff, the compost we know we can use, the vegetables and the fruits and stuff.
But it might still produce gases
That's true.
as
Yeah,
it's degrading. It
yeah,
probably does, but I don't know how much.
yeah.
What I've heard is that there's greater gas production associated with doing it in an uncontrolled way in a landfill.
Right. That makes sense.
So one question to ask, we're almost out of time here, is where do you waste food, and how could you change things in order to waste less food?
Mhm. Oh, that's cool. That's what I've been struggling with. My husband and I struggle with, how do we do this to not waste,
Mhm.
We try to eat everything that comes in and less to go out, but there's still waste. Oh,
I think learning how to preserve food has been helpful. Like even when there's a couple peppers in the bottom of my fridge or something that are going weird, I'll just pickle them and put them kind of in a can so they're shelf stable. And then also just freezing stuff. And I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's needed.
It's
Definitely.
better than throwing
Yeah.
them out.
I have
Yeah.
put a cucumber in and I eat a bit of it and then it goes mushy. And what do I do with that cucumber? I can't eat that mushy cucumber.
Yeah, I
Take
don't like mushy cucumbers.
Me either. And I throw it into the trash because I'm not doing composting because I'm not growing vegetables and things like that in my backyard.
So but maybe your neighbor is, and so maybe you could compost, and and your neighbor who's growing vegetables is going to be delighted to take your compost off your.
That's a good idea. I'll speak to my neighbors. I know there's some who grow things and I can certainly, yeah. Thanks.
Although what I would also say is it may be a more rational system rather than relying on individuals to do everything, to have a municipal system that collected food scraps separately,
Yes,
biological waste separately, and composted them centrally, and you could probably even make money out of it by selling it to, selling that product. But anyway, so there's individual solutions, there's community-based solutions, and
Yeah.
if we spread things out in that way, it's probably better.
I think one important way to not waste food on a personal level is to shop with a grocery list so that you're only buying what you need and
Yes.
you're not impulse buying a lot of things that then either you don't have time to eat before they go bad, or
Yeah.
you just you've got so much that some stuff is wasted. And I mostly relates to children, but serving people, like I see children throw out a lot of food. If you're in a school cafeteria or you're in any situation where you're feeding a lot of children, they take more than they want, or they just don't eat a lot of food. So I like to give kids a little tiny bit and let them come back for more, rather than having them throw out half of what's on their plate.
Yeah,
Yeah.
makes
That's great.
sense.
That makes more sense. Yeah.
Any other suggestions before we?
One of the things, the thing about the mushy cucumber, one of the things I found helpful is to cook large quantities so it's already prepared, and just make sure we eat it as leftovers
Mhm.
rather than have a little, half a cucumber sitting in the refrigerator, not in the salad. It's less likely to get used again than if it's already made. So we kind of eat through our week with stuff we made on the weekend, and as long as we really do eat the leftovers, we're using up what we've got.
Hmm.
It's been a challenge to figure out how to really do that, but I think we're getting better at it.
Yeah.
Also, if you're, the times that we're a little tighter, for watching our budget a little bit more, we don't, less inclined to say, I don't feel like cooking, let's just pick up food. So the ingredients are sitting there for another day or two. So that can be a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's the whole question of expiration of food, and when should you throw food out? When does it become waste?
Yeah.
And I think we're often quite ignorant about that, and so having better information about, okay, so is this still good to eat, or do I have to throw it out?
Yeah.
But as Grace said, if you cook it relatively soon, even if you're not eating it relatively soon, then that's gonna help stabilize it.
And it can be frozen and eaten later, but it's already prepared.
We haven't even talked about restaurants and restaurant food and the amount that you get
Oh my
served
gosh.
in restaurants, and what do you do with that? And
And they
that
throw
can
out
be-
a lot of stuff.
yes.
Out a lot of stuff.
Okay, well, I think we're past 8, so
Oh.
it's time to end.
Thank you, Hedley.
It's been a fun discussion.
That's been good.
Any other parting comments that you'd like to make?
We're unmuted.
Just thank you. Really
Yeah.
helpful information and really good discussion.
Good.
This has been
Yes,
u-
certainly. I'd
very
like to second that. Very well presented,
Thank you.
focusing on statistics and facts rather than opinions. I appreciate that.
Good.
yes. Thank you.
Okay. See you all next month.
All right, thanks,
We'll
Heather.
get the,
Okay.
we'll
Bye,
get the
everybody.
information. We'll get copies of those.
Yes.
Yes.
We
Thank you.
will. We will. I'll talk to Chelsea about it, and we'll get a list of the materials that I used.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.